Now then, Dmitri, you know how we've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb. The bomb, Dmitri. The hydrogen bomb.
Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hawk. My guests today are Battleship Bean and John Schilling, and they got in touch with me recently to suggest a podcast on nuclear war. And this is actually a follow-up to a meet-up discussion with a group from Less Wrong, where this subject was discussed in quite a lot of detail. Bean is a pseudonym, I guess, of the author of a very popular blog. He's an aerospace engineer in the defense industry and a naval historian. And I guess I can't tell you much more about him except to recommend very strongly that you check out his excellent blog, Naval Gazing. John Schilling is a well-known member of the rationalist community and is a frequent and highly respected contributor to the comment section of Scott Alexander's famous blog. John's an aerospace engineer in the US defense industry with a particular expertise in rocketry, so he's particularly well qualified for the subject under discussion. Anyway, welcome Bean and welcome John to the podcast.
Thank you for having us. I'm happy to be back.
Likewise.
So as regular listeners to the podcast will know, I quite like to talk about not just the subject under discussion, but to try and link it in with movies. And I thought the perfect movie to discuss for this one was Dr Strangleove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. So I was hoping you both got the chance to rewatch it, and we could maybe just kick off with seeing how you thought it held up and what your thoughts on it were generally. So, Bean, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, it's a great movie. I very much like it as a movie, and it's more accurate than you might think. You know, what was it? Kubrick started off wanting to make a thriller and ended up saying, no, this is comedic enough, it has to be a comedy.
I think the novel it's based on was actually intended to be, was actually a drama
yes.
or a thriller. And I think the author was actually quite angry that it got turned into a comedy or a satire.
And as I understand it, all of the actors playing the B-52 crew were told they were making a straight thriller so that they would play their roles absolutely straight.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And the other thing I thought about it was an incredibly theatrical piece. So I could see you doing this on stage. It would work absolutely fine. But the bit that really didn't fit the rest of the movie was the attack on the army base, or the Air Force base, I guess, where the camera has sort of got the shaky cam thing. And it could be like something out of the Vietnam War or something like that.
I know the scene you're talking to. Something like that was an essential part of the story, but it didn't quite fit the rest of the movie.
I actually really liked it because it really felt the only bit of the film that was actually realistic.
Yes.
In terms of its shooting style, everything else was very much set bound, and it's only got, you've got the war room, you've got the inside of the guy's office, and then you've got the inside of the B-52. And I think that's pretty much it.
That's pretty much it.
When you looked at the film, one of the things that goes wrong and starts a nuclear war is a rogue general. So that's one way that a disaster can start, or rather a nuclear war or a nuclear incident can start. Then you can have an accident where somehow accidentally a bomb is detonated. Then you might have this terrifying logic, particularly after maybe the end of the Second World War, where you think we should use the bomb first before they get to develop enough to use them on us. I was trying to think, what are the other situations where nuclear war might actually start? I guess terrorism?
Terrorism could result in the use of a nuclear weapon, but it's unlikely to escalate to nuclear war. I think nobody has any interest in building on a terrorist nuclear attack, and I think everybody is at this point reasonably capable of distinguishing. In particular, we know when missiles are launched.
And in the war room of Dr. Strangelove, you can see the planes moving across the map, and they used to have something called, I don't know if they still do, but they used to have these early warning systems, and you get these in the movies. You always see the planes moving across, and then it turns out, oops, we were actually looking at the moon by mistake, or we were actually looking at a flock of geese. Was that the case? Did these things really happen, and could they still happen?
both of those incidents did happen. There is a big difference between something that happens where they go, hey, we're picking up a signal, is this the start of a nuclear war, and actually pushing the button to respond. Everyone has always ensured there is some distance between signals and actually launching. The other famous incident is Petrov, a Russian officer who saw the Russian satellites detected reflections off clouds as launches of a few American ICBMs. And he decided not to pass the word on to his superiors. I actually think he probably gets more credit than he deserves on that, in that it's pretty obvious both to him and... Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to approach this differently. A lot of people basically think that all of this is very much on a hair trigger. And it's generally not. There's... Some of this dates back to one of my favorite hate figures, Robert McNamara, and the sort of Kennedy-Johnson administration, who did tend to think that everybody but them wanted to set off a nuclear war, and that's just not true. There's a bunch of space between something that looks like it might lead to a nuclear war and actually a nuclear war starting.
Do you not have the problem that if you wait, then your ability to launch is compromised, or they take out your entire civilian command structure, or maybe your entire military structure? So, your ability to respond is going to be compromised if you wait.
That is a risk factor. And one thing that some of your viewers may already know, and it will certainly come up, is that Russia has a system that they call a perimeter or dead hand, which is intended to launch missiles autonomously if there's a nuclear attack on Russia and Moscow is not sending orders. What doesn't get us much publicity is that system does not default to being on. That system is meant to be used in the Petrov scenario where there's an ambiguous warning and somebody doesn't know whether Russia is really under attack. Instead of having to make the terrible decision of do we retaliate under this uncertain information, they can flip on the automatic system, knowing that even if it turns out that this was an attack and that Russia has been destroyed, the retaliation that is their sole purpose will still happen.
And just so I understand that, the idea is that if you flip on the automatic system, you can wait for the bombs to fall on Moscow, you can have your high command wiped out, and then at the point where the system detects that the bombs have gone off, that's the point when it will automatically trigger the bombs from the Russian side. Right.
But on a normal average day, you're not worried about a sensor in that system failing and triggering the bombs, because on a normal average day, it isn't turned on.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, the problem with the Doomsday system that we see in Strangelove. You always have the risk of a system failure taking that out, and then you just render the Earth uninhabitable for a century thanks to...
Yes.
Thanks to a drunken worker in the factory that built some piece of the system.
Yes.
And this is what strikes me about the whole nuclear system, is that it's got all these fail-safes, it's got all these, there's all this engineering inside it, but as we know from civilian airliners, as we just know from our everyday life, sooner or later, if something can go wrong, if somebody can put something in the wrong way around, if somebody can drop something that damages something, if somebody can fail to tell their superior about something, inevitably that's going to happen. It's this Nassim Taleb black swan thing. You don't know what's coming. All you know is that something's coming, because that's just the nature of the world.
Yeah. I think we're pretty good at preventing this from happening by purely mechanical accident now. I think the sensors are more reliable than they were during the early Cold War era of Dr. Strangelove. I think we've gotten pretty good at building redundant command architectures. There's no way that risk ever goes absolutely to zero, but it gets pretty small. What's more concerning to me is the possibility of national leaders making bad decisions because they don't understand, really more at the political rather than the technical level, what they're facing. No nation is going to use nuclear weapons in anything less than an existential crisis where they think, if not their nation, at least their government, their regime is doomed. If they don't, or maybe doomed regardless. And so no nation will deliberately push another nuclear nation into that corner. But everybody sees where that inevitable doom corner is differently. So you can have a situation where one nuclear power thinks it is winning a limited war against another nuclear power, and therefore the other nuclear power will not trigger Armageddon over a limited nuclear war, or a limited conventional war, I should say, more likely. But the nuclear power on the receiving end of this sees it as an existential crisis. Maybe they think their regime is on particularly shaky ground, and even a conventional defeat will doom them. That leads to the potential for misunderstanding about what the other side's real intentions are, what the real consequences are, and the potentially for somebody figuring, I'm already doomed, I might as well push the button.
And you get regimes like, I guess I can think of some, but let's mention one which is in a sense uncontroversial. Everybody's allowed to say bad things about them. Let's say North Korea,
yes,
where it's not impossible to imagine that the regime starts to crumble from within. It's not necessarily being attacked from outside, but this is, in some ways, you would imagine that over a long period of time, that is not a stable regime.
Right.
Because it's sort of a system which is designed almost to deliver poverty and misery to its people. And so over, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, this highly paranoid leadership with nuclear weapons, they may be seeing what's happening in a way that's completely divorced from reality. There may be nobody pushing them over. It may actually be, they may be collapsing from within, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I have a joke, and then I will let John do this one. Well, in terms of stability, I mean, North Korea seems more stable than a bunch of other nuclear powers. For instance, France, which has had several changes of government in the time, where North Korea has had none in the last 70 years.
You're not adding to my sense of reassurance when you say that.
Feel free to edit that out if it didn't work. I was just making a joke about that. I will let John give the serious answer because he knows this.
Yeah, North Korea is a particular area of study for mine. And Bean's not wrong. The government is, at present, very stable. And it's very clear and specific that its nuclear weapons are only to ensure national and regime stability, to prevent foreign powers from invading the country or toppling the regime. But it's not unreasonable for them to fear, particularly the way some South Korean and American leaders have talked about the subject, it's not unreasonable for North Korea to fear that we might disregard their nuclear weapons and try to tear down their regime. We could do that. South Korea could do that. We could do that together or separately. And they could fear that even if that's not what's actually happening. And as you say, if they're facing an internal regime threat at the same time, that's a recipe for bad decisions.
And do we have any sense, because a lot of the safety that we've been talking about vis-a-vis America, and I think we think that safety has gotten a lot better since, as we say, the days of the Cold War in terms of command and control. Do we have any sense of what the command and control systems in North Korea are?
We do have some. And they're very jealous on the regime, I should say, is very jealous about securing absolute control of the nuclear weapons. So we know, for example, from defector interviews that North Korean generals are allowed to use chemical weapons on their own initiative, but not nuclear weapons. And we believe that with the nuclear weapons, the warheads and the missiles are stored separately, maybe under different ends of the same tunnel, but under different stewardship, different guard forces responding to different chain of command. So that really only if the orders come from the highest levels in the North Korean government can those systems be assembled and used for a nuclear attack.
Why do we think, and I don't know if this is one for Bean or for you, John, why do we think that countries like North Korea are so keen to have nuclear weapons? Is it to get respect, or are they genuinely terrified of what will happen if they don't have them?
Genuinely terrified of what they don't happen. In particular, they all learned the object lesson from Muammar Gaddafi, who for many years tried to obtain nuclear weapons to stabilize his regime, who did, we think, have chemical weapons for that purpose, who after 9/11 decided he was going to be the responsible leader, the good guy, stop going down this path of being an evil dictator with an arsenal of nuclear and chemical weapons, cut a deal with the West saying, I'm going to be the responsible guy from now on. And that lasted for 10 years. Then there was some trouble in Libya, and we basically threw him under a bus, leading to his being killed, while NATO planes bombed Libya and watched him hunted down and killed. So every other dictator in the world knows that that is their future, with one televised catastrophe turning public opinion against them. And they want an absolute safeguard against that.
Bean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it basically makes them immune from foreign intervention. That's why they want it. They don't want foreign intervention, so if you have this technology that makes them immune from it, they're going to take that. That's a pretty good deal for them.
This must have been something that the Western planners could see, that tearing down, allowing the dictatorship or tearing it down like this, when it had offered to and had actually given up its weapons, this was setting a terrible example. And I'm just slightly puzzled as to why Western policymakers went the way they did.
It was a triumph of short-term over long-term thinking, because in the short term, bringing down an evil dictator feels good, it wins votes. The old solution, where when somebody like Idi Amin or Augusto Pinochet loses power, they're allowed to retire gracefully to some remote seaside resort somewhere, is good for stability, but it looks bad, it feels bad, it makes you look like you've appeased a tyrant. That might cost you votes in an election. We apparently have decided to stop doing that, and the new way, very satisfying in the short term, potentially destabilizing in the long term.
It does feel like we're in an era now where morality is much more valued in politics. Consistency between your stated ideals and the actual way that you behave in the world. People are more idealistic, perhaps.
I would think a lot of that has to do with the end of the Cold War, because during the Cold War, effectively, we had this giant existential threat. And as a result, doing things that felt bad to deal with that threat was fairly easy to excuse. Today, we don't have that kind of threat, or we think we don't, and Western policymaking in general has not been particularly serious for the last 15 years or so. Without that threat, it's easy to get very hung up on moral principles. Not that moral principles are bad, just that international diplomacy is tricky and sometimes requires doing unpleasant things.
Yes. When you know you are facing the possibility of Armageddon, you are willing to compromise your principles to prevent that. When you are facing a tin pot dictator who is the butt of jokes on your late night talk show, compromising your principles in dealing with that buffoonish character as they will be presented, that doesn't feel so good, that doesn't look so good, people aren't just willing to do that. But the buffoonish dictators we make fun of on late night talk shows increasingly have nuclear missiles.
The title of the film is How I Learned to Stop Worrying About the Bomb. And it feels like we've stopped worrying about the bomb, and yet proliferation continues. We have North Korea.
Yes.
We have Pakistan. We have India. We have Iran. Not yet, but quite soon, I guess. We have Israel. I don't know what Saudi Arabia is planning to do.
I think they're planning to, from what I've heard, Saudi Arabia's plan when they need the bomb is to call Pakistan and say, hey, please deliver the bombs we paid for.
Yes. Yes.
You know, when I was growing up, everybody was terrified of nuclear war. You know, I was around during the Reagan-Thatcher years when CND were terrifically strong, when the Green and Common women were sort of tying themselves to the fence. And I think all these people in CND and the Green and Common women, they were dead right. It was terrifying. And
yes.
You know, the amount of nuclear warheads being delivered into Europe, I think it was just insane myself. But now we don't worry about it at all.
Yes.
If you were to give people, you know, a list of their top 10 worries, nuclear war, would it even get into the top 10? I don't think so. But if you were back in 1965 or 1970 or whatever, it would have been right up there, right?
Yes. I think with regard to Dr. Strangelove's amusing subtitle, you should not love the bomb. You should definitely have a calibrated worry of the bomb. I think we may have shifted from worrying too much to now worrying too little. But there's definitely a degree of worry that's appropriate.
Sometimes think it feels like we're just not capable of worrying about too many things at once, because now we've got COVID, we've got climate change. What else have we got to worry about?
Inflation.
We've got inflation, but existentially, let's just talk a little bit about COVID, because there's a lot of debate. Did it leak from a lab or didn't it? And to me, that's not really the interesting thing. The interesting thing to me is that it could have leaked from a lab.
Absolutely.
And they've been doing work in labs which are capable of producing something like COVID. And if it's capable of producing something like COVID, it's capable of producing something a lot worse. Building a nuclear bomb, Iran's been trying for goodness knows how long, and they are a very sophisticated country with plenty of money, and they haven't quite got there yet. But building one of these biolabs, that's not so hard.
Yes.
If ISIS would have been left on their own for a few months longer, I'm pretty sure they could have managed to build a biolab. And I feel like maybe that's where the existential threat is actually coming from.
I am very much in agreement that the existential threat comes from biological warfare. That is, without a doubt, the scariest thing. It is vastly scarier than nuclear weapons. Especially if we define existential as existence of the human race. Even at the height of the Cold War, we would not have killed all of humanity with a full-scale nuclear exchange. It just wasn't going to happen. Biological weapons have the potential to do that. I think the lab itself isn't necessarily the hard part of that. The big issue there, frankly, is probably testing the weapons. You need to do tests on some sort of animal, and that's probably, from what I understand, that's harder than you might think. Now, don't get me wrong. I am entirely in favor of strengthening the biological weapons convention, using everything in our power to get everyone to give that up. It is extremely terrifying.
And the same with the sorts of research that might as well be biological warfare development efforts from the way they're presented and implemented.
It does seem to me that there's been a huge amount of research going on, somewhat under the radar. And even now, as we talk about COVID, there seems to be a certain amount of obfuscation about what's been going on and who's been carrying it out. And it's in nobody's interest to talk about it. And yet it seems like the scientists have been thinking, this is all terribly interesting. And, perhaps with the best motives in the world, but they're developing this technology to produce more infectious agents and more pernicious agents. And I'm less worried about a state getting hold of this, because it seems like it's mutually assured destruction in a bottle, pretty much. But somebody like ISIS, or some people for whom Armageddon is just an aim in itself.
Yes.
Who knows who might decide that this is a good idea, and they have no interest in biological weapon conventions or anything like that.
Yeah,
absolutely. Stealing a quote from Batman rather than Dr. Strangelove, some people just want to watch the world burn. That's absolutely a factor. The one thing I think saves biological warfare from being a literal existential threat is that diseases, being living organisms, evolve. And no matter what the guy who built it in the lab wants, the disease has no advantage in killing all of its potential hosts. And we've seen this time and again, when it gets out, it evolves into something that mostly makes a lot of people a little sick, but still healthy enough to go around spreading the disease. But that doesn't happen overnight. It happens in fits and starts, and it's a random walk that sometimes goes off in the wrong direction. And you do get things like the Black Death that killed 30% of the population of Europe before that little particular pathogen decided that was not the sweet spot of lethality and miled it down a bit.
Y. pestis is still pretty dangerous today.
Yeah. It won't kill 30% of the population, but yeah.
It was also the bacterium that caused the Justinianic plague, where they reckon somewhere between 30% and 50% of the Roman world were killed. It's not existential,
right,
in the sense of it's not going to end humanity on Earth, but it's existential in the sense that it's hard to imagine. You've seen what we've been through when, the fatality rate is, something under 1%.
Yes.
Goodness knows what would happen to our civilization, at rates of 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I hoped would come out of COVID was increased attention to biodefense, and unfortunately that does not seem to have happened.
One thing I wanted to ask you both was, It's astonishing to me that a nuclear weapon has never gone off accidentally, because if you look back through the history, they've been dropped out of airplanes have crashed, airplanes have gone on fire on the runway, they've been dropped, explosive gone off. And I mean, obviously, nuclear bombs must be very hard to set off by accident. There must be something inherent to them, and maybe one of you can talk a little bit about what that is. But equally, have we not been very lucky as well?
In the early days, we were lucky. There are some bomb designs, particularly what are called gun assembly bombs, that are, at least in principle, capable of being detonated if you drop them in a fire with the safeties not fully in place. But what fundamentally saves us is that nuclear weapons are not just containers of nuclear-grade nitroglycerin. They're actually machines with complex moving parts that have to function. It's very easy to arrange for a car to crash accidentally. It's very difficult to arrange for a car to start and drive down the road accidentally. Machines don't generally start unless you make a deliberate effort. And if you instead make a deliberate effort with locked ignition systems and so forth to make certain this machine will never start, we're pretty good at that. So,
yeah.
Is this not this always never problem that they have, where the military want the bomb to go off every single time?
Yes.
And the safety guy wants it to never go off accidentally, and there's a tension between the two.
It's a tension we've solved by throwing huge, incredible amounts of money at it. The Department of Energy in the U.S. essentially spends most of its budget on making sure that this problem is solved, or if not most, a very significant fraction of its budget.
And just talking about, the size of the budget, I don't know, at the height of the Cold War, I don't know how many nuclear bombs there were. And everything's rotting, right? The missiles on which they're sitting on, if they're out in Europe, then the rain's raining down and they're rotting. The rockets contain fuel and the fuel lines are rotting. Everything degrades over time.
Yes.
And so everything's fine. Well, hopefully it's fine the day it comes off the production line. But when you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of these things, and then you have the Soviet Union just collapses. And nobody's maintaining this stuff anymore. And even in the US, I bet you anything, that stuff was not being maintained the way it was supposed to, because that's just in the nature of systems, is that, people forget about them and it becomes, redundant.
Yes.
So was there ever a risk that things go off because, or that there's problems because of that?
Not a risk of high-yield nuclear detonations. That requires that the machine be in good working order. What there is the risk of is nasty little accidents that break open the bomb and scatter its radioactive contents over the countryside, possibly with a small nuclear component to that.
Which did happen a couple times.
Yeah, that did happen. I'm not going to absolutely rule out the possibility of any nuclear reaction occurring in that context, but the farther you go up the scale from, oh, we got a reaction that destroyed a missile silo, towards, oh, we got a reaction that destroyed the city, the more unlikely that is, because the more it depends on the machine working perfectly. And the whole reason the accident happened was that the machine was defunct.
So that's the reason why, as far as we know anyway, a bomb has never gone off accidentally in the Soviet Union. I do know they've had terrible pollution there from nuclear accidents, but
Yes.
I mean, I read, and I think Bean, you're not a big fan of the book or certain aspects of it, but I read Eric Schlosser on a book called Command and Control, and I was very struck reading it at how the military bureaucracies for many years had strongly resisted spending money on safety devices. There were people within the establishment writing report after report saying, I think there was a bomb, the Mark 38. Where they believed it was inherently unsafe because the detonation mechanism was just a simple electrical current. There wasn't anything sophisticated. It didn't have to be putting out a particular sequence or signal. It was just on-off type thing. And they were terrified that if it was in a fire or whatever, it was possible that electrical current might be set off accidentally. And report after report, and yet the military really resisted it very strongly. And I was just very struck by that. I thought, why would the bureaucracy, behave like that? But then I thought, well, maybe that's just in the nature of bureaucracies.
I think a lot of that is probably just down to the fact that through most of the 50s, we were doing this fantastic nuclear buildup, and there were other systems that had significant problems. I can think of, I believe it was the W-47 they used on the early Polaris missiles, just had problem after problem after problem. They had to rebuild the things about 4 times to get them to work reliably and be stable over, a couple of years between trips back to the factory. With respect to those particular incidents, yes, I am not a fan of Schlosser's work. He has a very strong tendency to overplay things. The particular case in question, I believe, is most famously the 1961 Goldsboro B-52 crash when they had a airplane break up in midair and release 2 weapons. And usually you will hear that of the 4 safety systems, 2 of them failed on one bomb and 3 of them failed on the other.
Yeah.
In reality, the systems that failed of those, only one system actually failed in that it was supposed to work in that case and didn't. The other systems were the systems designed to, for instance, make sure the bomb was actually dropped out of an airplane before it went off, so it didn't just go off if it was sitting on the ground, which is a valuable system to have. But if the bomb falls out of an airplane that breaks up, it's not going to be, that system is not designed to tell the difference between the airplane broke up and, it's just designed to say, are we falling through the air? Yeah, we're falling through the air. Okay, I'm going to do my job.
But in a sense, the system that's failed is the aeroplane.
Yeah. One of the systems was designed to detect if the bomb had been dropped, and I believe it was like a pull-out wire that actually pulled out as the bomb left the plane on one of the 2 bombs that dropped. That one I would say failed. Again, the other systems, it's like saying if your car rolls over and the airbag doesn't go off. Did the airbag fail? No, not really. It's not supposed to go off in that situation. That's not what it's there for.
But I suppose Schlosser's point is that we only had one line of defense left, and that line of defense was not a strong one, in that it was not inconceivable that it could have failed because it was just a sort of a fairly simple electric current that needed to pass. Now, that's unlikely, but it's certainly the kind of thing that can happen when a plane's on fire.
And I'm not saying they shouldn't have had more safety. Yeah, they probably should have. But it is easy to overplay via selective quoting. Another example from the same, how dangerous this is. Another example from the same book is a case he talks about during the Cuban Missile Crisis when a bomb wing was told there will be no more drills. If you get the go signal, it's for real. And then they had, I think it was a bear light, get in past the perimeter fence and set off an alarm, and the response in that case is, we scramble the planes. And in his telling, the only thing that stopped that from turning into all-out nuclear war is some people like getting in a truck and driving on the runway and flagging the plane down and saying, hey, don't do that. Which is just completely untrue. If they'd gotten airborne, they would have gotten a call on the radio saying, hey, sorry about that, that was a bear, come home. Or they would have gotten to their fail-safe points and not gotten the message that says go, and then come home.
The terrifying thing about one of the terrifying things about the Cuban crisis was not that Kennedy or Khrushchev would actually have given the order to launch the weapons, is that both sides were worried that the other side would do so, and therefore the credibility of a false alarm would have gone through the roof. Because, there's the famous case where the Americans detect a nuclear attack and somebody says, well, where's Khrushchev? And somebody says, well, he's in New York. And everybody kind of relaxes and think, well, there's no way that can be a real attack. But everything's on a hair trigger, right, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because everybody's terrified that the other side are going to push the button first.
Yeah. It's about as close as we've ever come. One of the things the U.S. military does for nuclear weapons security is they have what they call the 2-man rule. If you're close to nuclear weapons, there have to be 2 people there, and they have to keep each other inside at all times. The Cuban Missile Crisis is about the closest I've ever seen to that being violated. They had people in single-seat planes sitting on the runway, fully armed, fueled, ready to go. And I think that, with a guy in the cockpit. I don't think they were ever airborne, but they were close.
Yeah.
It very much so. I mean, although in practice the bigger risk there was the nuclear torpedoes on some of the Soviet submarines, which I believe one of them, the captain tried to order it be fired and got shot down.
Not literally shot down, fortunately. But that does bring up the other danger point of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the delegation of nuclear launch authority down to tactical commanders in the field. Because as I said earlier, nobody uses nuclear weapons unless they are facing a truly existential crisis. But to the president in Washington or the premier in Moscow, existential crisis means our nation is going to be destroyed. And that's a pretty tall order. To the commander of a submarine or warship in a potential war zone, his ship being sunk is to him an existential crisis. It's a lot easier for him to talk himself into believing that, oh yeah, this is as bad as we can get, and I have a nuclear weapon and I'm going to use it. And that came terrifyingly close to happen during the Cuban Missile Crisis. An American destroyer was dropping basically hand grenades on a Russian submarine to say, we know you're there. But a Russian submarine has no way of telling the difference between a hand grenade exploding 10 feet away and a depth charge exploding 200 feet away. And they figured the game was up for them, they might as well.
And what stopped them?
The two-man rule, which the Russians had in their own form. There was a political officer on board the submarine intended to make certain that the captain's tactical military decisions were in line with the political imperatives of the Soviet Union. Political officers get a bad rap in the military because they mostly interfere with things the military needs to do. But the military didn't need to launch a nuclear torpedo in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So on that day, the political officer was absolutely right.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the other things that struck me about the command and control book is how we've moved from, they got to the stage, didn't they, during the Cold War, where they had B-52s. They had the Strategic Air Command had B-52s in the air all the time. And I guess that's part of what happened in Dr Strangleove, right?
Yes.
But they don't do that anymore, do they?
They do not.
That's stopped now.
Right.
That is very much stopped.
Yeah.
That stopped even, I want to say, in the mid-'60s as a continuous thing.
And why did it stop?
Better system. We have better ways of doing the same mission. Because the big concern with airborne alert, and one of the things that, to back up a little bit, nuclear war is a pretty big sort of diverse field in terms of what it would look like, how it would be fought, etc. There's a tremendous difference between how a nuclear war in the early 50s would look versus one in the early 60s versus one in, say, the early 70s versus today. Early on, when it's all bombers, you're going to have lots of warning. There's no way that somebody can really do a sneak attack and catch you. You know, you have probably a couple hours before the Soviets can get to the bomber bases, certainly before they get to all of them. Ballistic missiles change that. They can be at the target in 15 minutes, and if your force is built around bombers, and there were serious concerns in the early 50s that ballistic missiles just, couldn't be done. It just wasn't going to work. So they didn't really build the force around this. You know, if you have bombers, they take a while to get to their target. They can't necessarily be launched that quickly. So the answer is, okay, we'll just keep some of them airborne all the time. You really can't attack those with a ballistic missile. Then, as time goes on, we get our own ballistic missiles, and the Minuteman was named as it is because you were supposed to be able to launch it in a minute. You know, we pick up, oh, hey, that's very definitely a Soviet attack because there's, 1,000 warheads coming. It's not just like one thing going, hey, maybe that's a warhead. We can launch the Minuteman. Also, ballistic missile submarines. Again, there's not really any way to take those out ahead of time. So you can now tank the first strike and still have an effective deterrent for the second. So no reason to keep bombers on airborne alert, and it's honestly pretty dangerous. Accidents happen when flying planes, and when the planes are carrying nuclear warheads. Even if the warhead itself isn't going to go off, it's still going to make a mess.
I do remember that NORAD once did show thousands of missiles heading towards the US, and it turned out that some technician had loaded a training tape by mistake.
Yeah.
And usually there's some double checking I think they do. They're not just going to launch on one of those.
Yeah.
Still, it's terrifying to think that that a mistake like that can actually, a mistake like that can happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. The relevant movie there is War Games, and while anything can happen, I think the movie War Games got the most likely scenario, which is that generals do not want to destroy the world. when faced with anything remotely ambiguous on that side, they're going to err on the side of wait and see before we destroy the world. If it means an air base in Maine or Alaska gets destroyed before we respond, we can live with that. So I think we're pretty...
Well, can I ask a question about that then? Because there's a line in Dr. Strangelove where one of the people on board the B-52 says, gee, I wonder if they're testing us to see if we really would go ahead. Because they don't think it's for real. So they think, well, what's going on? They think, well, maybe they're testing to see that we would actually, do what we've been trained to do. How many of the crews would have gone ahead and dropped the bomb? 100% or 50%? Any thoughts?
I think it'd be near 100%.
Yeah, it may not be exactly 100%, but yeah, it'll be above 80 or 90.
So even though the world is coming to an end, people will still do their job to bring it about, because that's mass murder, right? We're talking about beyond anything that the Nazis unleashed.
Well, it's mass homicide. It's not necessarily mass murder, because most of these weapons are targeted at military targets. In the case of Dr. Strangelove, that bomber was targeting an ICBM base. If there had been an actual war and they had carried out their mission in time to do any good, they would have saved American lives, because they would have destroyed Russian ICBMs on the ground. Not every nuclear targeting scenario is quite that clear cut, but most of them there's a colorable case that if you believe that your nation is the good guys, delivering this weapon will on the net make the world a better place.
Yeah, the question is, what do people believe, right?
Yeah. By the time you get to sit in the left seat of a B-52 or the command console of a nuclear missile silo, you and everybody around you is pretty sure that you trust your commanders, or they pick someone else for that job.
And back in the day, because this was another thing that came out of command and control, was that the targeting had gone mad, because they were sending like an H-bomb to destroy a bridge, and then they were sending another 3 just to make sure. It seems like they had so many missiles or so many bombs, they didn't quite know what to do with them. And so the blanket coverage was just monstrous. And I wanted to come back to something you said, Bean, about, do we have any sense of what's the effect on the world if there had been a full-scale nuclear war where that number of bombs were being dropped by the Soviet Union and by America?
We have some idea. Okay, to start with the question about what the targeting plan was, I should probably start by saying that nobody just targets people with nuclear weapons. There's always something else. It's not to say that a lot of people wouldn't be killed. Yes, every target mentioned in Strangelove is clearly a military. It's either like an ICBM complex or a military base. But
that's in Strangelove.
Yes.
I mean, in the real world, there's a big debate, and there was a debate in World War II, where, for example, the Allies and the Bomber Command in Britain, they deliberately bombed civilians, although I think they called it quite delicately, they called it dehousing.
Yes, which I am honestly of the opinion that Arthur Harris was a war criminal for that policy. That was it didn't work, and B, it was morally monstrous.
But then you could say the same thing about the firebombing of Tokyo, perhaps, or Kobe.
I would actually sort of disagree with that, in that I should probably bring up Curtis LeMay at this point, who was the American commander there, and later was commander of SAC for most of the 50s, was a brilliant operator. And you look at it, because a lot of the problem with the dehousing campaign was that it did not work. It just did not do what it was supposed to do.
Right, that's one problem. But the other problem is it's killing, women and children.
Yes.
In massive numbers. I mean, let's not lose sight of that.
And that is clearly a bad thing. And I'm not saying that LeMay doing it to Japan was a good thing, but there is a significant difference between this is a side effect of the thing we're trying to do, which in his case was destroy the dispersed infrastructure. For instance, the firebombing of Tokyo essentially destroyed the Japanese radar industry. They just stopped producing radars after that. And there were other effects too. That's just the one I remember offhand. it's tragic, and I'm sure if LeMay had the option to not kill the women and children and to do that via conventional bombing, he would have. And he did continue to do conventional bombing against targets that were susceptible to it. Oil refineries, steelworks, that kind of stuff, where you can't just put it in a bunch of, light buildings scattered around.
I wonder about that, and I don't know enough really to say, but I do get the sense that the war in the Pacific was one where human life was held pretty cheap. I think there was a sense of real vengeance being visited. It's quite interesting how quickly it switched off after the war and became, almost instantly aid to Japan was provided in very significant quantities, food and so on. But 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Actually, it was Nagasaki. I can't remember which one went first.
Hiroshima.
But there weren't many tears shed at the time, I don't think, knowing perfectly well what they were doing.
Yeah, the Japanese set the tone for that by valuing the lives of the Chinese at approximately 0, which is what inspired us to start meddling in the Pacific. And then after Pearl Harbor, we returned the favor and placed very little value on Japanese life.
Yeah.
The only thing that mattered was, does this contribute to victory? The good news is that killing civilians per se rarely contributes to victory. There are some scenarios where threatening to kill civilians will deter an attack. There are maybe a few civilians or a few cases where killing civilians will demoralize a nation to the point where resistance will collapse, but that's very rare.
But is this not the whole logic of nuclear war, is that if you're trying to deter the enemy, one of the ways you deter the enemy is you say, I'm going to launch 8 hydrogen bombs onto Moscow. And there, it's a form of terrorism, if you like.
Yeah.
I don't think that's not the normal way targeting plans are worked out. I mean, that's sort of a side effect. You don't launch a bomb labeled Moscow. You launch a bomb labeled the Kremlin, which is in the middle of Moscow, admittedly, or a bomb labeled biggest tractor plant in Moscow. Again, yes, it's in Moscow, but these are things that are less directly than an ICBM base, but are still significantly contributing to Russia's ability to hurt the U.S.
Yes.
They're not just aiming at the city as a whole, because, I mean, if nothing else, cities are there because they have important things in them. And those important things ultimately are the root of economic and military power. Destroying those is an entirely reasonable thing to want to do in a war, and so you target those. And yeah, somebody who lives near it is not going to have a good time with it. But effectively, that's a not particularly desired side effect in most cases. And frankly, it's one of the reasons we've seen tactical nuclear weapons go away, is because we gained the ability to destroy those kind of targets without using them nearly as effectively. And so just, okay, we don't need them anymore.
Yes. The other, and I don't want to call this a benefit, but it's certainly an effect of the increased power of nuclear weapons, is that you sort of don't have to choose. I mean, when Arthur Harris was bombing residential districts in German cities, he was by definition not bombing factories or military bases. He believed he saw a benefit in killing civilians, so he did that. If you're launching nuclear missiles at Moscow, you don't have to choose. If there is any benefit to killing Russian civilians, either in fact or as a threat, you pick that up incidentally by targeting the other things that you were going to destroy anyway. There's never a point at which you say, oh, I've only killed 30 million Russians. That's not enough to deter the Russians. I have to draw circles on a map to maximize the number of people I've encompassed with my nuclear blasts. You attack the military targets, you attack the industrial targets, you will, and maybe you consider this desirable, maybe you consider it regrettable, but one way or another, you will have killed enough people to accomplish anything that you can realistically hope to accomplish by killing people.
I asked the question of Bean, and I'll sort of ask it again. We got slightly sidetracked. Is what would a nuclear war look like? And I guess I'm thinking in particular about the subject of nuclear winter.
Ah, yes, that I can speak to. Nuclear winter is about 80% made up. It may have been slightly less made up in the past, but actually no. As of today, it's more like 90-95% made up. The basic concept was originated by Carl Sagan and some other scientists in that field in the early 80s. And Sagan was a very staunch anti-nuclear advocate and essentially brought it up as sort of a new way of generating animus against nuclear weapons. And I can provide references for that in the show notes. Oh, actually, I can link to the blog post I wrote about this. Since then, the literature has been kept alive thanks to the efforts of three guys, two of whom were authors on the original nuclear war paper back in the 80s, and the third of which has been working in there since the early 90s. There's a couple different aspects to the modeling. There's, how much soot does the war generate? What does that do? And the weird thing is, the soot generation figures have been consistent since, again, the late 80s, early 90s, despite the fact that we have something like 10% as many nuclear weapons that are likely to be used today as we did back then. They're cooking the models. The more recent models we see used are just utterly ludicrous and involve the most spectacular displays of how to rig a scientific paper. The targeting is not based on what is militarily useful. It's based on how many flammable things are there here. Then they scale their nuclear blast burn areas from Hiroshima rather than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or other sort of a better model, even though Hiroshima, for the same size of bomb, burned about 4 times as much as Nagasaki.
So they're daisy-chaining every possible worst-case value.
Yes. To the point where, conservatively, they are overestimating the effects of nuclear winter by a factor of about 50. That's taking conservative, like the minimum, reasonable values. I have a blog post where I work through all of this.
But Bean, what I'm not getting here, and I've asked to talk about nuclear winter, which is what you are talking about.
Yeah.
But when I think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these are A bombs. And then you hear what an H bomb is capable of. And I don't know what the multiple is, but is it 1,000 times, 100 times, 400 times more powerful? I don't know how many H bombs there are in the world or were in the world, but it's a lot.
Okay, this is another area, rather like nuclear war, where the scale varies greatly. To put this into perspective, the largest bomb the U.S. ever tested was something called Castle Bravo. It was about 15 megatons, which is 1,000 times bigger than the weapons used against Japan, which are about 1,000 times bigger than the largest conventional bomb currently in the U.S. arsenal. So this covers a tremendous range. In practical terms, the ones in use today are going to be somewhere between about 10 and 30 times the effectiveness or the size of the ones used on Japan. There's a tiny handful of weapons that are outside that range, but they're not likely to be dropped on cities or, targets in cities. They're going to be used on some very, very special targets, and, there's probably a dozen of those in the U.S. targeting plan.
It's also worth noting that the effects of a nuclear weapon are not linear with its yield, so that when he says the biggest atomic or biggest hydrogen bomb was 1,000 times as powerful as Hiroshima, it would probably only have been about 100 times as destructive as Hiroshima. The modern weapons that are 10 to 30 times the size of Hiroshima bomb, maybe 5 to 10 times as destructive. The larger the bomb is, the more its energy is wasted making craters and pretty fireballs, but not destroying things at ground level. And that is one of the things that is not correctly captured in most of the modeling of nuclear winter.
Yes.
That effect is deliberately ignored. I'm not sure it was deliberately ignored or whether it was just carelessness and ignorance, but either way, it's one of the several factors making that analysis not credible. They just simply do not know how destructive nuclear weapons really are. They get the math fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, that's a factor of 2 to 3 in my estimate. The biggest one is actually a factor of between 4 and 13, depending on the numbers, because somebody else ran an analysis using a more sophisticated model of how much soot actually gets into the stratosphere where it persists for a long time. The standard paper by Toon and Robach is about 80%. They got somewhere between 6 and 20%.
Yeah.
And then another thing people are terrified of is, will they be able to use their iPhones after a nuclear attack? Is Twitter gone for a number of years?
We can hope.
The best we can say there is we don't know for sure, but probably most stuff will be repairable. And unfortunately, the last test data that we really have from this was from about 15 years ago. So, maybe the modern iPhones are more vulnerable than the ones 15 years ago. You're talking, I believe, about electromagnetic pulse, the idea that a nuclear weapon is...
Sure, I'm talking about will your car still work? Will the power grid be knocked out completely?
Right.
Will your computer still work, which is important, obviously, because, our entire world is computers now. And then slightly more trivially, will I be able to check my email? But not completely trivial.
Yeah, that was actually tested in about 2004. Not with actual nuclear weapons, obviously, but earlier testing had given us a pretty good measurement of what the electromagnetic effects of nuclear explosions are. We built big, fancy, high-powered electric gadgets that could simulate that in a warehouse-sized building, mostly for classified studies of military hardware, but on one occasion they said, okay, we're going to take a bunch of late-model cars and trucks with all their computerized ignition systems and engine control systems and whatnot and see if they still work. And the answer was a lot of them stopped working temporarily. You had to either turn them off and turn them back on again, or disconnect the battery and reconnect the battery. I think only one of about 50 vehicles that they tested had to be towed off to a repair shop. So there's an enormous amount of disruption that occurs when you use nuclear weapons. And the famous case was a nuclear airburst somewhere over the Pacific that knocked out a section of streetlights in Hawaii, but not every streetlight in Hawaii. It's random chaotic disruption, most of which can be fixed. And you can always hypothesize that the very latest generation of electronics is so much more sensitive than anything came before that it would be much worse than that. I don't know a way to completely rule that out. But at the same time, we put electronics in cars. Cars are harsh environments where you have lots of high voltage electric sparks going around. There's a limit to how vulnerable a thing can be and survive in that environment. So I don't think there's a very high risk of permanent and total destruction of electronics and power grids.
Sure, just finish off talking a little bit about the war in Ukraine. People have talked about that it's madness for us to be confronting a nuclear power like Russia, and Russia has been sort of hinting that maybe nuclear weapons are not off the table. Do you take any of that seriously, or is this just all chitter chatter?
I don't completely discount it. I think it's highly unlikely, but it is something that has to be considered as we approach an endgame. I don't think it amounts to Russia will use nuclear weapons to conquer Ukraine. That just doesn't make sense because that risks nuclear retaliation, not from Ukraine, but from NATO, which is on Ukraine's borders and would potentially feel threatened. Russia's not going to take even a small risk of losing Russia to gain Ukraine. The risk is that if Ukraine somehow pulls out a decisive victory, which is unlikely but possible, and it looks like Russia is collapsing across every front, the possibility of Ukrainian tank battalions marching into Russia becomes on the table, then Russia might see an existential threat. Then it becomes much more credible that they use nuclear weapons. And that would require some careful management in the event of a decisive Ukrainian victory in this war. Somehow we have to make it clear that decisive Ukrainian victory does not mean the end of Russia.
It seems very unlikely that, it seems any kind of victory seems pretty far away, and certainly a decisive one where the Russian forces just collapse seems far-fetched, right?
I think that's what the Germans thought in 1916, but...
Yes, the breaking point of an army is very hard to measure until it's in the rearview mirror.
But it seems like it's the Ukrainians who are taking the terrible casualties at the moment. I wouldn't be surprised if their breaking point is closer, but I know nothing about it.
Either one could happen. Either of these armies could break tomorrow, or we could still be fighting this war in 6 months. It's completely unpredictable. The nuclear scenarios are one fringe of that. They're not particularly relevant right now. They might become relevant in some endgames.
Yeah. It was slightly concerning early on when Putin was acting irrational and sort of rattling a nuclear saber a bit. He's backed off on that, which is comforting. I should probably, at this point, put in my usual plug for... But even then, this is why we should invest more in missile defenses, so that hopefully next time we can stand up to him with somewhat greater confidence that things aren't going to go very badly if he does decide to launch.
So just talk about that a bit more, because are you suggesting that this be missile defense which will defend the United States, or are you talking about this as missile defense that you can move into the Ukraine so they can use it? What are you talking about?
I'm in favor of both. One of the big problems with ballistic missiles is that very short response time we mentioned earlier. That tends to lead to bad decisions and a lack of flexibility. But at the same time, one of the advantages of ballistic missiles is, besides going fast, they're not actually all that hard to shoot down.
Really?
Conceptually, it's very simple. Conceptually, it's no harder than hitting a baseball or, a cricket ball, for you.
Right. You only get one shot at it, and at cricket, they play and miss quite often.
Yes, but at the same time, they're also not using radar.
Also, you are allowed to have multiple batters in missile defense. You are allowed to have multiple batters.
Okay, but let me ask you, John, do you believe in missile? Well, I mean, there's two problems with missile defense. One is it might not work.
Yes.
The other problem is that the mutual assured destruction has been taken off the table, and all of a sudden the other guy can launch a first attack and get away with it because he's no longer facing retaliation, because he can deal with the retaliation. That was always the argument against the Reagan system, that he's actually making the world more dangerous rather than less dangerous.
The one thing we can take off the table, I think, is the model of missile defense as the impenetrable deflector shield that means you don't have to worry about the other guy's nuclear missiles. A full-scale nuclear attack, regardless of what missile defenses we have, if Russia decides to unload on us, that will be very bad and millions of people will die. But it might not have to be apocalyptically bad. And we should always strive to turn apocalypses into mere catastrophes.
Yes, I very much agree with that. There is no plausible world in which we are able to produce a system that can stop every missile. And there is no world leader since probably Stalin who would be willing to say, yeah, I'll just lose like 10% of my cities and come out on top, and this is a good deal for me. The deterrent effect is now, instead of losing most of our cities, we lose a few of our cities. Effectively, people are pretty sort of scope insensitive to increased numbers of to the number of nuclear weapons aimed at them. We are effectively deterred by North Korea, which has 6 nuclear weapons aimed at us. We are effectively deterred by Russia, which has about 1,500. We were equally effectively deterred by Russia when they had 10,000, or what was it, something like 100,000 aimed at us. I was not alive during the Cold War, but you two were. Are you really that much less scared now that we're down to 1,500 warheads? Like, viscerally less deterred?
For some reason, I'm less frightened of nuclear war simply because the state of relations between the two parties is completely different. There's no sense of this sort of struggle to the death between two competing systems.
Yeah.
But you're quite right. I've never understood why this idea that you had to have 4,500 missiles in your arsenal when, and I think plenty of Cold War planners said, we only need 200 or 300.
Yeah.
And for some reason, the logic produced something like 10 times that number. But there were plenty of people saying, we don't need that many missiles in order to effectively deter. And I think they were right. And I think you're right. 10 missiles would do it. Losing New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and London. Yeah. That's enough. That's all you need.
We have 3 votes out of 5 among the major nuclear powers, Britain, France, and China, that 200 to 300 warheads is enough. That they are confident nobody will accept that price, the 200 to 300 warhead retaliation, to attack them. The U.S. and Russia during the Cold War were playing a different game. I'm not sure that I agree that game was ever winnable, but they were. Now we're headed back slowly in the direction of enough nuclear weapons to deter any potential attacker, which maybe it's 1,000, it's not 10,000.
Yeah. I'm a little bit more in favor of large arsenals. If you asked me to pick the sort of sweet spot, I would say probably 4,000.
But you work in the defense industry.
I don't work with nuclear weapons. But at the same time, I think the 1,500 we have now is perfectly adequate, and I'm certain, I don't think there's a strong need to grow the arsenal. I would be opposed to cutting it down to the 200 to 300. I think that's just a little bit too unstable, and I think Britain and France are essentially sort of free riding on the American arsenal. During the Cold War, Britain's arsenal was quite explicitly, this means that we are going to be able to draw the Americans into a nuclear war with Russia. It wasn't, we think this is enough on its own. It was, we think this is enough to get the Americans in.
You just mentioned briefly, John, China, and I guess they are the rising power now. Do you have a sense of what their strategy is? Before it seemed to be, a very minor number, just enough to make sure that nobody came near. Do they have expansionist plans in their nuclear industry?
To some extent, probably, but not to a large extent. I'm limited in how much I can say about this, not because I have access to U.S. classified information, but because I once had a very candid conversation with a Chinese military officer in their strategic nuclear forces about this. And I promised that I would not repeat that for diplomatic purposes. They are, to some extent, concerned that 300 might not be enough. I think 300 is the current number, might not be enough in some total war scenarios with the United States. That if we launched a preemptive strike and everything broke our way, their force might be whittled down to something that would not adequately deter us. But that's talking about modest improvements, either in the number of weapons or in the survivability of weapons. It could go either way. They're not talking about building something like the Russian Cold War arsenal.
And I guess after Japan, China probably came closest to any country on Earth to actually being on the wrong end of a nuclear weapon from the United States.
Yes.
I'm talking about the Korean War here.
Yes.
That was Douglas MacArthur talking. He was not in charge. He thought he wanted to be in charge very badly. He was not in charge, and that was made clear to him. And then he was quickly not in the military anymore.
This is another one of the reasons why you really don't want to give nuclear weapons to battlefield commanders and say, use at your discretion. I don't know what would have happened if Douglas MacArthur had actually had control of nuclear weapons, as opposed to having to ask Truman for permission to use nuclear weapons.
It's probably also worth pointing out that this was the era where essentially Stalin was still in control of the world communist movement and was essentially, China was in the war at his command.
I would like to put an opposing view to that. I think that the Americans believed that Stalin was in control of the Chinese, and as a result, they did not think the Chinese would intervene because they correctly judged that Stalin was not interested in a confrontation there. And I think Mao had his own ideas, and once he'd been sort of turned away from Taiwan by the Americans, he had an army ready to go, albeit one designed for jungle warfare and for the tropics, and he turned that on the Americans in the north, and I don't think the Russians had any idea that he was going to do that.
I mean, given the degree of Russian involvement in the war, most notably the supply of MiG-15s, they can't have been too far away, and this was only 2 years after the end of the Chinese Civil War. I'm not sure how far Mao could have gotten if Stalin wanted to stop him. The other point I would bring up in favor of the war being essentially Stalin's is the timing of its end. It ended 2 or 3 months after Stalin died. And they'd been stalemated for quite a while. There was nothing that changed, broadly speaking, except that Stalin was now dead and no longer saying to the Chinese and North Koreans, hey, no, keep it going. That was really the only significant change made for 2 years before that point.
Well, I wouldn't like to argue that Stalin had no influence on the war, and certainly you're right about the Air Force, but I think the decision to invade North Korea by the Chinese was one that the Chinese took very much themselves. And it was an extraordinary achievement when you consider it was effectively a peasant army, carrying their supplies on, horses and donkeys and yaks and whatever. It was quite a remarkable military achievement on their part to achieve what they did. You'd think it would be completely impossible, but they managed to do it.
No, very much agreed there, and it should have been completely impossible. The Americans thought it was, and that is one of the main reasons it worked, actually.
Yeah. Thankfully, the Chinese didn't have nuclear weapons at the time, so goodness knows what would have happened.
There honestly weren't that many nuclear weapons anywhere at the time. I think that was still the era when the U.S. would have taken, had probably a double-digit number and, would have taken like 3 weeks, and the Soviets had a single-digit number and would have taken a month from the go command to be able to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
No, the scale of the buildup during the 50s was just incredible, and you kind of see that at its height in Strangelove, to circle back around to where we started. I remember reading, it was at the National Atomic Museum in Albuquerque, they said that at one point something like 7 or 8% of the country's entire electrical supply was going into the nuclear weapons production in the 50s, the U.S.'s entire electrical supply.
Gosh.
It was a truly astonishing achievement.
Yes.
Well, now we put all our electricity into Bitcoin, for better or worse.
Yeah, actually, a fair bit of the same electricity. They did a lot of that's done up in the Columbia River Basin, where they've got the cheap hydro, which is where the U.S. did a lot of that because there was a lot of cheap hydropower. I've actually been to the Hanford site where they did produced all the plutonium.
Gosh,
it's a neat experience if you happen to be in that corner of the world.
Okay, well, look, we've hit, at least on my timer, I'll probably edit a few bits out, but we've hit over an hour and a half now, so we probably should draw it to a close. I'm sure I've missed out a lot, and I would like to talk more about Strangelove, because I think it's an absolutely brilliant film. I think it's an absolute towering achievement, and when I watched it the other day, I was amazed at how well it held up. Peter Sellers is just fantastic, particularly his turn as the US president. Just wonderful.
No, I agree.
John, have you anything that you want to add before we close?
Again, I'll repeat the point. We should definitely not love the bomb. We should worry about it moderately. It's still a very real threat. It's potentially the worst catastrophe on the horizon, the worst catastrophe since the Black Death, as we mentioned before, but not extinction bad, not truly apocalyptically bad. Somewhere in the middle.
I will sort of agree with that and sort of take a slightly contrarian point, where I will point out, yes, it could be the worst catastrophe since the Black Death, or even worse than that. But at the same time, it's also meant that we haven't had a great power war since 1945.
Well, okay, I'll bite on that. I want to bite on that because we've seen the Russian military fail dismally in the Ukraine. So everybody was terrified that Stalin was about to roll over Western Europe. And I guess my question is, had the Nazis been gutted to the extent that they were no longer able to resist, or were the Soviet armies at that stage so strong that they actually were able to roll over Western Europe if they'd wanted to? So sorry to start us off again, but that's an interesting question to me.
It's a little of both.
Yes.
The Soviet army at its best, anywhere from 1945 to 1985, was a much more capable force than the Russian army we're seeing today, at least in overall competence. I mean, modern weapons might shift the math a bit, but the Russian army over the past 20, 30 years has taken a nosedive in the quality of its people and its organization. That said, it was never the unstoppable behemoth that so many of us feared during the Cold War, where all of NATO together couldn't stop them from driving across the Rhine into the Atlantic.
Yeah.
That war would probably have looked a lot like the Ukrainian war. The Russians would have made some very spectacular advances, devastated a great deal of landscape, but they would ultimately have come up short against their objectives. Their opponents were more capable than they even believed themselves. And then, well, we can see how ugly that turns out to be after the first few weeks. So
I think it depends greatly on when. In certain eras, the Red Army did have a substantial conventional superiority. In other eras, it didn't. It's also worth pointing out that the dynamics were heavily influenced by the existence of nuclear weapons.
yeah,
At various points, NATO could say, no, we're not going to try to face you conventionally. We're just going to say, if you cross this line, we're just going to use the bomb.
You say we're going to use the bomb, but I was shocked reading Schlosser's book. I had no idea they had nuclear landmines.
yes.
They even had rifles that could fire nuclear missiles. I was like, I had no idea that any of this was the case.
We were basically telling the Russians, there are 1,000 field-grade officers, each with a nuclear weapon. If you attack, one of them will launch his nuclear weapon. That's a statistical guarantee at that point.
I'm just surprised nobody dropped it on their toe.
Yeah, that's the problem. You have 1,000 people now with the power and authority to make a really catastrophic mistake. So on the one hand, having nuclear weapons meant that for the duration of the Cold War, we never had to see something like Ukraine play out across all of Western Europe, which would have been a real possibility and a truly disastrous one. But it also meant that every time we were rolling the dice on a lot of people not making stupid mistakes.
Okay, that seems like a good place to end it. Bean, thank you very much. John, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Glad to be able to. Yeah, glad you were willing to have me back.
We'll meet again.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media, and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.